Hello, class. This is Dr. Zeno, and this is your screencast for the week. I apologize. I'm also under the weather, so bear with my froggy voice. So at this time, I'd like you to pause this screencast and start a Google Doc, put your name on it, and share it with me. I would like you to change the settings when you share so that I can make comments on your writing. During this screencast, I would like you to write every question that I post. Some will be written on a slide and some will be verbally said by me. Write those questions and then answer those questions. This screencast will count as 2 class participation grades. I anticipate that with the writing of the answers, the watching of the videos, and listening to my squeaky voice, that it should take anywhere from 2 to 2 hours and 15 minutes to get through the whole thing. So at this time, I'm going to begin the presentation. Right now, I'd like you to go to this website that you see here. It's a report written by Secretary General Kofi Annan called We the Peoples. Read pages 47 to 49. And what I'd like you to do is explain Annan's justification of humanitarian intervention. Which countries does he cite in his justification? And how would you answer Annan's question? If humanitarian intervention is indeed an unacceptable assault on sovereignty, how should we respond to a Rwanda, to a Srebrenica, to gross and systematic violations of human rights that offend every precept of our common humanity? Pause the screencast at this time now, and please read those 3 pages and answer the questions. Okay, in addition to that, I'd like you to reflect on this question. When is it okay for countries to intervene in the affairs of other countries? So think about all the terrible things that you've learned about this semester: terrorism, genocide, mass rape. And when is it okay for countries to intervene in the affairs of other countries? Go ahead and pause the screencast and write your answer on that Google Doc. I would also like you to watch this 2.5-minute video, which is President Eisenhower warning us of the military-industrial complex. Watch it and then come back to the lecture that I'm giving. After World War II, there was this idea of peace through strength. This is a strategy that seeks to create negative peace through preparing for and sometimes starting wars. Lead nations to create militaries that can be used as negotiating tools or coercion to force ceasefires, détentes, surrenders, and treaties. Ronald Reagan was a big supporter of peace through strength. This strategy remains common today but fails more than it succeeds. For example, we have Iran, Iraq, Israel, Soviet Union, and the US are all examples of countries that failed to achieve goals by this strategy of peace through strength. And even the United Nations has used peace through strength, and their mission have failed. Peace through strength often leads to increased violence rather than negative peace. The doctrine of peace through strength persists not because it often works, but because it is strongly supported in many countries by influential constituencies committed to promoting their national militaries. War and preparing for it provides employment. Also, peace through strength. Most people want their country to be strong, and strength is synonymous with physical force, coercion, and violence. Okay, so America is one of those countries that values peace through strength. So tonight is all about peacekeeping. So what is it? It's the maintenance of international peace and security by the development of military forces in a particular area. Peacekeeping is mainly done by the United Nations. I'd like you to watch this Al Jazeera video, which is a little bit over 8 minutes long. And I would like you to go into that Google Doc, write these 3 questions down, and answer them. Once you're done doing that, you're going to move over to the next slide. At this time, we're going to look at the history of UN peacekeeping. So peacekeeping is an aspect of international law. The purpose of creating the United Nations, the Charter of the United Nations, which is the foundational document for all the UN work, was to establish the idea to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And one of its main purposes is to maintain international peace and security. Peacekeeping, as I mentioned, is connected with international law. with matters of peace and war, with matters of the use of force, human rights, humanitarian interventions, and genocide. So let's look at the history. After World War II, these peacekeeping missions. The United Nations peacekeeping missions were limited to maintaining ceasefires and stabilizing situations on the ground and providing crucial support for political efforts to resolve conflict by peaceful means. This was very successful. These missions consisted of unarmed military observers and lightly armed troops that monitored, reported in their roles. So, for example, from 1956 to 1967, UN Emergency Force One was dispatched to the Suez Canal in Egypt, and they supervised the withdrawal of troops in the area. In addition to that, we have the first UN peacekeeping mission. It's considered the first peacekeeping mission. Between 1964 and present, Cyprus is another peacekeeping mission where UN troops were sent in to stop fighting between the Greeks and Turkish communities. So how did this come about? We have the idea of the Security Council. So the UN Charter establishes the roles of the Secretary General and the Security Council. The Charter gives the advantage to the Security Council. They're the executive order of the UN, the one that holds the keys to the main policy and operational decisions related to international peace and security issues. They address who's a member, they speak for the entire United Nations, and they decide if a dispute is a threat to warrant intervention. So this includes United States, United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia. They also decide to send in peacekeepers. Since the 1990s, though, the role of peacekeeping has definitely changed. In the 1990s, we see the modern humanitarian intervention first considered after the Cold War. It recognized that times had changed after the Cold War and that the Council had to take responsibility. But there were critical differences among the permanent members of the UN Security Council. For example, it's always China and Russia versus the United States, United Kingdom, and France. Such divisions are still evident today. So, for example, in 2012, the Security Council, United States, United Kingdom, and France voted to intervene in Syria, while Russia and China voted to not. The reason why is because China and Russia favor maintenance of status quo, and they take a conservative approach to addressing humanitarian crises. They both believe that they do not want to breach sovereignty. For China considers enforcement contradictory to the principles of mutual respect for sovereignty. So they believe in non-interference in internal affairs, even when there's a gross human rights violations. China's view of this is strong when it views the mission as based on humanitarian and human rights concerns. China worries that these interventions would further enhance the international influence of the West, especially the United States. So when faced with having to decide on the use of force, China often abstains from voting to show disagreement. So, for example, they did that for Bosnia, Kosovo, and Rwanda. Russia, before the 1990s, was able to project power. Their influence then took a hit after the fall of Russia in 1990. So, faced with huge economic and political difficulties in their state of transition, Russia's actions in the United Nations were limited in the 1990s. So in the 1990s, the international community wanted humanitarian crises on the agenda of the Security Council. And even though humanitarian crises was the main issue, they were not seen as vital. So the result was a limited commitment, actions taken with limits, or at worst, hardly anything would be done, as in the case of Rwanda, which we're going to talk about a little later. In the 2000s, and onward, China and Russia take a backseat to the United States, United Kingdom, and France, who lead the Security Council. There's this further rise of humanitarian intervention and the rise of responsibility to protect. So you read that article at the beginning of this screencast. The responsibility to protect was put forth by Secretary General Kofi Annan, and it's a norm. It was built on the idea that sovereign nations have a responsibility to protect its citizens from 4 major events. These events are ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. And there are 3 pillars that constitute this initiative. Number 1, states A state has the responsibility to keep their citizens safe from the events stated above. 2, the international community is responsible for helping states fulfill their responsibility to protect. The international community should use peaceful methods like diplomacy and humanitarian actions first. Then further actions like the use of collective forces under the United Nations Security Council are to be utilized to protect citizens. In 2005, 150 countries signed this document. So responsibility to protect is this idea is now enjoying widespread legitimacy. Okay. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Libya and Syria later on in this screencast. One moment while I get my paperwork in order. Okay. So what is responsibility to protect? What I'd like you to do is look at the Kofi Annan article and determine what is the responsibility to protect. Okay. I'm going to give you a historic overview, and you're going to determine whether or not it's legal. Give me one moment. Thank you for your patience. Okay, sorry about that. The 2000s gave rise to the idea of responsibility to protect. So it was an initiative that was established in 2005 by the United Nations. It is not a law, but rather a norm or set of principles built on the idea that sovereign nations have a responsibility to protect its citizens from 4 major events that I mentioned: ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. And I also mentioned already the 3 pillars. Okay. So this idea of responsibility to protect, or RTP, grew from a shift from interstate wars to interstate conflicts, with innocent civilians becoming targets, which we talked about all semester. The world witnessed the failure by the international community to stop genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, and Bosnia. So the idea of it came out of Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General at the time that you read that article. Okay. And by 2005, it became a norm. Almost everybody believed that this should not happen anymore. So it does then beg the question, is this a legal document? Okay, so let me read what it says here. According to the website International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect, it is a new international security and human rights norm to address the international community's failure to prevent and stop genocides, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. It is not exactly a legal doctrine because it has no institution formed around it, nor an enforcement mechanism in place to monitor violations. Instead, it's just an idea put forth originally by Kofi Annan and addressed by the United Nations. Okay, so sometimes it works inconsistently because there's no enforcement mechanism, and that's where the problem lies when it comes to responsibility to protect. And sometimes it is used to put forth some kind of military intervention. Which brings us to an example of Libya. You are going to watch this video. You're going to start it at 5 minutes and 30 seconds, and you're going to end it at 18 minutes, 30 seconds. So start it at 5 minutes, 30 seconds, and end at 18 minutes and 30 seconds, okay? You're going to put the questions that you see on this slide onto that Google document, and you're going to answer these questions. We went into Libya under the Obama administration as a responsibility to protect. You're going to see whether or not it truly worked. So please take a moment to watch this video. Sorry, and answer the questions. So pause it at this time. Okay, so two things happened as a result of our intervention in Libya. The first one, when it comes to Syria, is that Western intervention in Libya exacerbated the civil conflict in Syria. When NATO started bombing Libyan forces in March 2011, Syria's uprising was mainly nonviolent. Sorry, and its government response, although criminally disproportionate, was relatively circumscribed, and it killed fewer than 100 Syrians per week. But after the NATO intervention helped Libya's rebels turn the tide against Gaddafi in the summer of 2011, Syria's uprising turned violent, escalating the conflict and leading to 1,500 deaths per week by 2013. Also, so that was one. It gave hope to rebels thinking that there would be an intervention, and there wasn't in the beginning. Number two, it also scared off China and Russia from intervening in Syria because of all the things that happened in Libya. Okay, so instead of a strong regime, we now have a hotbed of terrorism in the country of Libya. So UN peacekeeping sometimes is a good thing and sometimes is a bad thing. When we look at their UN building activities through peacekeeping, this is the role they mainly play. If they just stay in the lane and do this, the things that you see on the screen, then everything is fine. So this includes the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatants. It includes mine action, like sweeping for mines, security sector reform and other rule of law-related activities, protection and promotion of human rights, electoral assistance, support for the restoration and extension of state authority, and promotion of socio and economic recovery and development. When peacekeeping missions are given these mandates, they are successful. It's when they come out and have to become armed troops, that's when it's a problem. The Charter of the United Nations is the foundational document for all UN work. The UN was established, as we mentioned, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, and one of its main purposes is to maintain international peace and security. Peacekeeping, although not explicitly provided for in the Charter, has evolved into one of the main tools used by the United Nations to achieve this purpose. The Charter gives the Security Council primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. And in fulfilling this responsibility, the Council may adopt a range of measures, including the establishment of a UN peacekeeping operation. So, Chapter 6 deals with the Pacific settlement disputes. UN peacekeeping operations have traditionally been associated with this chapter. However, the Security Council need not refer to a specific chapter of the Charter when passing a resolution authorizing the deployment of UN peacekeeping operations, and it has never invoked Chapter 6. Chapter 7 contains provisions related to the action with respect to peace. In recent years, the Council has adopted the practice of invoking Chapter 7 of the Charter when authorizing the deployment of UN peacekeeping operations into volatile post-conflict settings, where the state is unable to maintain security and public order. The Security Council's invocation of Chapter 7 in these situations, in addition to denoting the legal basis for its action, can also be seen as a statement of firm political resolve and a means of reminding the parties to the conflict and the wider UN membership of their obligation to give effect to the Security Council decisions. Chapter 8 of the Charter provides for the involvement of regional arrangements and agencies in the maintenance of international peace and security, provided such activities are consistent with the purposes and principles outlined in Chapter 1 of the Charter. So it has 4 mandates in peacekeeping. 1, to deploy to prevent the outbreak of conflict or spillover of conflict across borders. 2, to stabilize conflict situations after a ceasefire, to create an environment for the parties to reach a lasting peace agreement. 3, assist in implementing comprehensive peace agreements. And 4, to lead states or territories through a transition to a stable government based on democratic principles, good governance, and economic development. So in 1994, you could see how much money was spent on UN peacekeeping. We're looking at about $3.2 billion a year. And in 2008, the OECD DAC reported that the UN peacekeeping expenditures had reached a historic high with 20 ongoing missions at the same time. Personnel had increased by over 700% since 1999 to 110,000 personnel with a budget of $7 billion. And in 2011, 2012, that's $7.8 billion. There are strengths that are associated with peacekeeping. Peacekeeping has unique strengths that include legitimacy, burden sharing, and the ability to deploy and sustain troops and police from around the globe, integrating them with civilian peacekeepers to advance multidimensional mandates. Okay, so when I say legitimacy, there's a respect for the United Nations. Burden sharing means that every country will send a certain amount of troops to be in the peacekeeping mission. Okay, UN peacekeeping keepers provide security and the political and peace building support to help countries make the difficult early transition from conflict to peace. And they're guided by three principles. The first is the consent of the parties. UN peacekeeping operations are deployed with the consent of the main parties to the conflict. This requires a commitment by the parties to a political process. Their acceptance of a peacekeeping operation provides the UN with the necessary freedom of action, both political and physical, to carry out its mandated tasks. In the absence of such consent, a peacekeeping operation risks becoming a party to the conflict and being drawn towards enforcement action and away from its fundamental role of keeping the peace. That's really, really important. It must have consent. Second is impartiality. Impartiality is crucial to maintaining the consent and cooperation of the main parties, but should not be confused with neutrality or inactivity. United Nations peacekeepers should be impartial in their dealings with the parties to the conflict, but not neutral to the execution of their mandate. Just as a good referee is impartial, but will penalize infractions, so a peacekeeping peace process or the international norms and principles that a United Nations peacekeeping operation upholds. Notwithstanding the needs to establish and maintain good relations with the parties, a peacekeeping operation must scrupulously avoid activities that might compromise its image of impartiality, as you are going to see in Bosnia in a few moments. A mission should not shy away from rigorous application of the principle of impartiality for fear of misinterpretation or retaliation. Failure to do so may undermine the peacekeeping operation's credibility and legitimacy and may lead to the withdrawal of consent for its presence by one or more of the parties. And number 3, non-use of force except in self-defense and defense of the mandate. UN peacekeeping operations are not an enforcement tool. That's really, really, really important to remember. However, they may use force at the tactical level with the authorization of the Security Council if acting in self-defense and defense of the mandate. In certain volatile situations, the Security Council has given UN peacekeeping operations robust mandates authorizing them to use all necessary means to deter forceful attempts to disrupt the political process, to protect civilians under imminent threat of physical attack, and or to assist the national authorities in maintaining law and order. A UN peacekeeping operation should only use force as a measure of the last resort. It should always be calibrated in a precise, proportional, and appropriate manner within the principle of the minimum force necessary to achieve the desired effects, while sustaining consent for the mission and its mandate. The use of force by a UN peacekeeping mission operation always has political implications and can often give rise to unforeseen circumstances. Okay, so just take a moment to read the UN peacekeeping successes. So a successful UN peacekeeping mission fosters reconciliation by conducting successful peacekeeping operations. It has been successful in other countries like Cambodia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mozambique, Namibia, and Tajikistan. Okay, so they're successful also if they have these other factors and conditions. So you saw up there the main reasons for success, which is those 3 guidelines. Okay, so here are the other factors and conditions that should be taken into consideration. 1, a genuine commitment to the political process by the parties in working towards peace. So there must be a peace to keep in order for this to work. They cannot go in the middle of the conflict. 2, credible and achievable mandates with matching personnel, logistical, and financial resources, which often doesn't happen. 3, unity of purpose within the Security Council with active support to UN operations in the field, which very rarely happens as well because it's US, UK, and France versus China and Russia. 4, the host country's commitment to unhindered UN operations and freedom of movement. 5, supportive engagement by neighboring countries and regional actors, which often happens. 6, an integrated UN approach, effective coordination with other actors on the ground, and good communication within the host country authorities and populations, which definitely did not happen in Rwanda. And 7, the utmost sensitivity towards the local population and upholding the highest standards of professionalism and good conduct. Peacekeepers must avoid becoming part of the problem. There have been instances where peacekeepers have murdered people, raped people, so this is a problem as well. So I would like you to watch this video of what happened in Bosnia. You're going to describe the conflict and how the UN peacekeepers failed. So take a moment to pause this screencast, go watch the video, and then come back to me and go to the next slide. Okay. Also, I asked you this week to watch the video on Romeo Dallaire. He was the commander in charge of the Rwandan peacekeeping mission. Okay. So I would like you to watch this video as well. And I want you to reflect on what happened in Rwanda by going to the next slide. So here's the next slide. So I want you to review below all these things I just read to you about how the United Nations is determined as the conditions and factors needed for a successful UN peacekeeping mission. Also keep in mind those 3 guidelines that we talked about as well. So apply these elements to the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda, and then explain in your Google Doc why Rwanda was not a successful mission. So you're going to look at the 3 guidelines, and you're going to look at all these other factors and conditions, and then explain why Rwanda was not a successful mission in your Google form. Okay, finally, today's peacekeeping. Today's multidimensional peacekeeping operations are called upon not only to maintain peace and security, but also to facilitate the political process, to protect civilians, to assist in the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants, to support the organization of elections, to protect and promote human rights, and to assist in restoring the rule of law. Currently, there are 14 UN peacekeeping operations deployed across 4 continents. So peacekeeping is flexible, and over the past 2 decades, they have been deployed in many different configurations, as you can see from this map here. And finally, some parting thoughts on UN peacekeeping. Sustainable peace is the measure of successful peace building. Successful and unsuccessful efforts to resolve civil war are influenced by the degree of hostility of the factions, the extent of local capacities remaining after war, these would be institutions still in place, and the amount of international assistance. Peace operations supplemented by extensive programs to rebuild economies have become part of promoting a long-term peace. So it is needed, but not in the way that happened in Rwanda or Bosnia. Okay. So one of the things I want you to take away from tonight is that the United Nations is very poor at war. They're poor at imposing a settlement by force. It can be good at peace, though, mediating and implementing a comprehensive negotiated peace. And finally, the UN as a multilateral organization cannot manage force as rationally as is necessary, but is well suited to mediate, mobilize, and manage legitimate international assistance. So don't come away from thinking about the UN as a terrible organization. It is good at peace and bad at war. And once it's involved in peacekeeping the way it's supposed to be, it is successful. So for next week, you are going to look at peace building through retributive justice. So here are some of the questions that I want you to look at, okay, when you are writing your reading memo for next week. There are 3 articles that you're going to be looking at. The United States Department of the State, What is Transitional Justice? It's a super easy article that you're going to read, which is our point of view on transitional justice and what the United States does to promote transitional justice in other countries. Arthur Page's How Transitions Reshaped Human Rights, Conceptual History of Transitional Justice from Human Rights Quarterly. And Ruth Title's Transitional Justice Genealogy. Actually, I'm going to take out Transitional Justice Genealogy. Do not do Ruth Title's Transitional Justice Genealogy. Do not do Rudy Title's Transitional Justice Genealogy. I'm only going to give you the two because the title article is hard to read. So just do the two. Thank you for listening to me and my terrible cough. I'm sorry that happened. I will miss you this week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. If you have any questions, please email me. Take care.